Welcome to the Bible Forum. I'm Warren Sprouse. I got a question for you. How old is Grandma? I want you to stay with this piece. It's short. The answer will come at the end, and it might blow you away. Depends on how old you are. One evening, a grandson was talking to his grandmother about current events. The grandson asked the grandmother what she thought about the shootings at schools, about the computer age, and just about things in general. And Grandma replied saying, "Well, let me think a minute. I was born before frozen foods, before Xerox, before contact lenses, before Frisbees, and the pill. There were no credit cards, laser beams, ballpoint pens. Men had not yet invented pantyhose, air conditioners, dishwashers, clothes dryers, and clothes were hung out to dry in the fresh air, and men hadn't yet walked on the moon. I got married first and then lived together. Every family had a father and a mother. And until I was 25 years of age, I called every man older than me, sir. And after I turned 25, I still called policemen and every man with a title, sir. All of this was before gay rights, computer dating, dual careers, daycare centers, and group therapy. Our lives were governed by the Ten Commandments, good judgment, common sense. We were taught to know the difference between right and wrong, to stand up and take responsibility for our actions. Serving your country was a privilege. Living in this country was a bigger privilege. We thought fast food was what people ate during Lent. They were fasting. Having a meaningful relationship meant getting along with your cousins. Draft dodgers were those who closed front doors as the evening breeze started. Time sharing meant time with the family, as it spent this time together in evenings and weekends. It was not the purchasing of condominiums. We didn't have condominiums. We never heard of FM radios, tape decks, CDs, electric typewriters, yogurt, or guys wearing earrings. We listened to big bands, Jack Benny and the president's speeches on our radios. If you saw something with "Made in Japan" on it, it was probably junk. The term "making out" referred to how you did your school exam or your taxes. Pizza Hut, McDonald's, instant coffee, nobody had ever heard of them. We had 5 and 10 cent stores, many of us called them 5 and dimes, where you could actually buy things for 5 and 10 cents. Ice cream cones, phone calls, rides on a streetcar, and a Pepsi were all a nickel. And if you didn't want to splurge, you could spend your nickel on enough stamps to mail 1 letter and 2 postcards. You could buy a new Ford Coupe for $600, but who knew anybody could afford one? And too bad, because gas was 11 cents a gallon. In my day, grass was mowed, Coke was a cold drink, pot was something your mother cooked in, and rock music was your grandmother's lullaby. Aides were helpers in the principal's office. Chip meant a piece of wood. Hardware was found in the hardware store, and software wasn't even a word. We were the last generation to actually believe that a lady needed a husband to have a baby. We volunteered to protect our precious country. This is probably why people now call us old and confused and say there's a generation gap. I would note that that term started in the 1960s, a time when young people were not simply acting like young people, irresponsible and rude, but they were advocating for the destruction of rules, standards, and religious values. So how old do you think Grandma is? Well, this woman would be 67 years old. That's this year, 2019. That's it. 67 years old. I'm 9 years older than this lady. She would have been born in late 1952. Now do you know why our nation is such turmoil and confusion? Now do you know why that generation, the 1960s, who are now grandparents, in some cases grandparents, are sires of people who advocate for the overturning of all objective moral standards. Why? Because objective right, objective wrong, aside from the fact that it is demanding, that it has no give in it, aside from that, or probably because of that, we're upset as it reflects on the existence of a God. A God who is objective right, objective wrong, who is the moral standard. Something outside of us, outside of our planet. He is a being. And he brings a force that represents the differences in men and women, in right and wrong. And that's why he's been thrown out the door, out into the trash heap. We don't want him around anymore. I grew up during the Second World War. My father was gone for 5 years. At least 3.5 of them out of the country. The only contact my mother had was letters that he might get a chance to write. Did she go off and have a fling with other guys? No, it wasn't done. By the time he left for the islands, he was a Marine, she had 2 babies. And she lived with her mother. Then she lived with an uncle. And then she lived with her mother-in-law. And my dad sent what he could home to try to help. I never saw my dad until I was about 5 years old. I don't have much memory of him before I was 8 years old. It was a different time. It was a simpler time. But along with that, it was a more moral time. In neighborhoods all over the country, there were people living who were not moral. But in those days, everybody in the community knew who they were, knew where they lived. And as children, we didn't. But I remember there were some houses in our neighborhood that I wasn't allowed to go in. I delivered papers as a young fellow, had to collect money. Don't go in that house. Why? Don't go in the house. What's that? Do what you're told. No explanation. I look back on it and I wonder if there weren't some people in our neighborhood that weren't all that nice and all that right. My parents didn't want me to get tainted by that, not to go in and experience any of that. You snuck around if you wanted to smoke a cigarette or have a beer. And I tried both, and like either one of them. It wasn't because I was a goody-goody. I didn't like it. It was awful stuff. God was protecting me. God gave me parents that protected me. And God protected me. Those days are gone. Even the kids that grew up in my generation, married and so forth, didn't raise their children the way I did. And their children didn't raise their children anywhere near the way their parents did. My children, thankfully, raised their children very close to the way I did. Not the same. It's never going to be. But there's no telling what the future's going to bring. And it pretty much started in this country, was stimulated after the Second World War. And I think it was because of the stress, the strain, and what these GIs and others saw when they got out of their neighborhood. And they got thrown in with people they'd never met before, people who lived all different kinds of ways. It became a little more cosmopolitan. And then to be thrust into a battle over in a foreign country to see how those people live. And to this day, those people don't live as well as we do. The movies, the TV makes it look like they do, but they don't. We got it good over here. And all we can think about is how to ruin it. Isn't that amazing? And people say there's no such thing as sin in the world. Sin is a degrader. And we're being degraded.